Welcome to today's Baker Tilly webinar. Before we begin, we'll cover a few housekeeping items. To the right of your screen, there are multiple application engagement tools you can use. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the Q&A engagement tool. Next to the Q&A application is the polling section. Here, a pop-up screen will appear with a question. Please select your answer and click Submit. Once you submit your answer, the polling question will close. To find additional session documents, click Resources. Here, you can find session-related content to download such as the PowerPoint slides, relevant documents, and more. After the webinar concludes, you will receive an email with a link to watch the recording. Lastly, don't forget to take the post-event survey. This will be available on your engagement panel to the right of your screen shortly before the webinar concludes. Our team greatly appreciates your feedback and we use it to guide future content development. Now, let's pass it over to today's speakers.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the industry forecast for 2025 and beyond. My name is Darren Jones, principal of Baker Tilly. Happy to be with you all today. Share some perspectives, share some insights, share some of what we've learned through 2024, some of what we're hearing from the industry as they begin and embark upon 2025. Number of key areas we want to make sure that we highlight and touch on. So we're going to talk today a little bit about what we see happening in the capital markets, what we see happening from an M&A point of view within the industry. We're going to have a little bit of a conversation around the regulatory landscape, potential impacts from the new administration, what we see happening in Congress, some of the pending legislation, and what that may mean for us in the industry. As we talk about regulations and we talk about streamlining business operations, a conversation around corporate compliance and ethics, specifically as it relates to engagement with global healthcare professionals. We continue to see a large effort from ethics and compliance teams across the industry. As we talk about risk management, I'm excited to have a little bit of a conversation about enterprise risk management. Compliance and ethics being one of several risk domains that we in the industry need to manage. So let's talk a little bit about what we see as some of the leading practices in 2025 related to ERM. And as we talk about risk management, in our industry, so much of our strategy driven off of medical and clinical evidence. So a conversation around evidence generation, how evidence generation helps to manage and mitigate risk, will be an important part of our session today as well towards the end. If you missed it during the opening preamble, we do want this to be an engaging conversation as much as we can when meeting virtually like this. So please feel free to use the Q&A function inside that right-hand panel. We've got a team of professionals that are going to be monitoring that Q&A, responding to questions in that Q&A section, or even here if it fits into the conversation that we're going to be having. And with that, let me pull in my esteemed colleagues to introduce themselves. Again, so I'm Darren Jones, our firm-wide industry leader for life sciences, and happy to be joined by our panel of colleagues, and I'll let each of them introduce themselves.
Great, I can start. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Scallon. I'm a principal in Baker Tilly's digital healthcare strategy and transformation practice. And I focus on life sciences compliance and ethics services for our clients, both through, for the last 25 years through compliance advisory services, as well as the provision of technology products to our clients. Michelle?
Hello, I'm Michelle Kupka. I'm an audit principal in our Boston office, and I lead our life science practice in New England. I've serviced companies in the life science industry for my entire career, which spans over 30 years. I started my career at Arthur Andersen in Boston, and my tenure at Baker Tilly is just over 22 years.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Abel. I am a principal in the Tewksbury office for Baker Tilly. I'm also the national lead for our federal credits and incentives practice, which includes R&D tax credits and all issues related to R&D, depreciation optimization, and areas related to federal statutory credits. I've been working in the credit area for 24 years now, and I'm really excited to be joining you today.
Hello, I am John Regula. I'm a managing director in our advisory risk practice at Baker Tilly. I am one of our leaders around enterprise risk management consulting services, and I've been bringing those services to market for the last 25 years. And very much looking forward to the conversation today.
Hello, everyone. Tim Nugent. I'm a managing director here at Baker Tilly. Been here for a few years with years of experience in both big four and smaller consulting practices in areas of government price reporting, in areas of gross to net, and helping people financially report and understand all the mechanisms around that, as well as overall operations and revenue management within the life science industry. It's a pleasure being here and look forward to a great conversation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Samantha Sutherland. I'm a director in our compliance and ethics team, primarily focusing on being an outsourced chief compliance officer for some of our clients and building and developing global compliance programs, including kind of touching on that higher risk area of HCP engagement and implementing technology tools that support all of those company-wide compliance processes. So excited to be a part of the webinar today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mario Prohaski. I'm also director with our digital strategy and transformation practice focused on compliance and ethics services. Have been in the industry for about 15 years now with global experience in compliance program design and operations. Also strong focus on HCP engagement controls, which I'm excited to cover later in the presentation. And yeah, really looking forward to today's conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Keith Needham. I'm a senior manager inside of our healthcare consulting practice. I've been with Baker Tilly just over 10 years, focusing on product adoption strategies across key stakeholders with clients within the life sciences industry. Prior to Baker Tilly, I worked at a large hospital system in Manhattan. And before that, I worked for a rural health plan in Pennsylvania. Looking forward to the discussion today.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for those introductions. Thank you all for joining us today on this panel. With that, I mean, let's kind of move and kind of bring the Michelles on the center stage and talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the financial markets right now inside of our industry. Maybe Michelle Kupka, kind of starting with you a little bit. What do you think the capital market landscape, how did it look in 2024 as you reflect on that? And how do you think that's going to translate into some of the key changes this year?
Yeah, thanks, Darren. On the capital market landscape, we noticed a notable recovery in 2024, and particularly towards the latter half of 2024. Interest rates in the third quarter provided some relief to life science companies. Early stage deal value did rise to 10.6 million in Q3, which was up from the prior year. Investments over 25 million represented 84% of total deal value. So there was some exit activity that reached 34 billion across 83 deals in 2024, and so that did surpass prior year levels. But again, a lot of that pickup we saw was in towards the latter half of 2024 and towards the end. And that gives us continued momentum going into 2025. We do expect to see increased pickup, more activity in M&A, certainly a focus on advancements in digital and scientific innovations. But the life science industry is expected to maintain or exceed historical benchmarks of 200 billion in annual deal value. Regarding IPOs and M&A activity, for the first quarter of 2024, there were 5 life science IPOs, and then by mid-year, U.S. biotech IPO funding matched the total from 2022. So you can see that there was increased volume in 2024. M&A activity also picked up in 24, driven by lower valuations and big pharma's desire to strengthen their pipelines. So as we start off in 2025 and as we look forward for the rest of 2025, We do see life science VC funding and IPO activities picking up pace. We've recently been speaking with our client base as well as prospects that are preparing now for IPOs. So there's a lot of good activity that is stirring for plans for later on this year.
So Michelle, maybe a quick kind of dig into one of the items that you said. You got to mention, about, M&A activity possibly picking up as a result of lower valuations, right? And people seeing opportunity or kind of discounts, in the market. One of the things we've also seen is sort of the cash reserves, for pharma in particular, has really swelled. Again, estimated to be, over $500 billion potentially that is sitting out there in terms of dry powder and cash in the balance sheets. I mean, what do you think? What impact do you think that may play in 2025?
Yeah, it should play a huge impact, as you mentioned, right? There is so much dry powder and cash reserves for this industry. So the industry is poised for significant growth and real transformation for 2025. With these cash reserves, again, we'll see that pick up in M&A activity. Certainly investments in certain areas that we expect to see, such as artificial intelligence. Big investments in that area across the board for all companies in this sector. Seeing an increase in personalized medicine, so personalized therapeutics for individuals based on their genetic makeup. Again, technological advancements will be huge and global expansion for companies in this space. So there really should be access to capital given the reserves and how significant they are and earmarked for companies in this space.
And the growth and the challenges, right? So we think about, the growth drivers and the challenges, what should folks be on the lookout for in the coming year?
Yeah, so just to comment again before we leave 2024, some of those growth drivers we saw were in cancer therapeutics, huge spends in R&D and outsourced manufacturing. Some of those challenges that were present in 2024 had to do with higher costs of manufacturing and regulatory hurdles that I'm sure everyone is quite familiar with. But for 2025, the theme is really optimism for companies in this space. Although there are some challenges and some headwinds to overcome, 75% of global life science executives anticipate positive growth for 2025. So that's a great indicator of where we're all headed for this next year. Again, investors are likely to favor companies with strong data and pathways to profitability. So really assessing the market potential prior to commercialization is key for companies in this stage. But early to mid-stage biotech companies should continue to be attractive buyout candidates. And we think that MedTech M&A will focus on emerging technologies like robotics, data, and AI-related companies.
Yeah, great points. Michelle Abel, as we, think about some of the tax code implications, obviously, with the deal flow and with the complex structures that our clients generally face already from a tax standpoint, I'm curious, what are some of the specialty tax or some of the R&D tax credit considerations that you see evolving or changing as we move into the new year?
Sure. Well, R&D tax credits are always a hot topic for companies to be thinking about. Michelle Kupka was just mentioning AI, robotics, personalized therapeutics developments, and other areas of huge spend in R&D. So, looking at the R&D tax credits, they can really be an easy way to reduce tax liability, which in turn allows increased cash flow, which in turn allows enabling and optimizing investment in future development. So the federal credit, and in many cases the state credit, is available to companies in any industry that develop new products or processes or improve upon existing products or processes. And in the life sciences industry, clearly, we see that almost everywhere. So, companies that qualify can claim their expenses in terms of wages, supplies, cloud computing, even if that's used, and contract research costs that are associated with R&D activities. But something that's important to think about here is that even startups or other companies who do not yet have income tax liability can take advantage of these credits. So for certain startups, the credits can be applied against payroll tax liabilities, even if they're not used in the current year, because those credits can be carried forward for 20 years. But the payroll tax liability is something that's only been possible in more recent years, and not everybody is aware that that's another way to take advantage of the credits when there is no federal income tax liability. And one other thing to think about with respect to R&D is that for companies who are likely to be acquired in the future, the R&D tax credits will not only add value due to the reasons that I just mentioned, but they should be a consideration in terms of whether their quantitative and qualitative documentation is in place and will be accepted during the due diligence process. So, of course, I'm always very excited to talk about R&D. And I have a whole dedicated R&D tax services team with members in offices all over the country who provide specialty tax compliance for these things. So would, of course, look forward to the opportunity to discuss R&D with anyone who would like to know more. So,
No, I think that's great. I mean, this whole area of leveraging the R&D tax credits, I like what you mentioned about using that in due diligence, almost viewing it as an asset that can be leveraged, especially with the carry forward that you mentioned. And I do think that's an area often overlooked or underappreciated, inside of our industry. Again, I have a lot of young companies doing a lot of things really fast, and sometimes you just don't have the time to really focus on some of those finer details that can really add value. With that, as we talk about reform. Unfortunately, tax reform is not something that we're talking about on the horizon, but certainly PBM reform is an area I think that we see a little bit of movement towards. And with that, I want to bring Mark Scallon and Tim Nugent into the conversation, and talk a little bit about PBM reform, in particular. Let's kind of start there. Tim, putting you in the hot seat for a moment. PBM reform appears to be a major focal point for healthcare reform in 2025. Certainly an area where I think we've seen, some legal action. We've seen bipartisan commentary, related to PBM reform. What's your perspective on the background and the need for reform and what industry really needs to prepare for?
Yeah, and when you think about the reform, you got to think about what were originally PBMs here for. They were here to, and not to sound redundant, manage drug benefit, pharmacy drug benefit, right? As well as negotiate lower drug costs. However, over the years, and quite frankly, a while now, they've expanded their role within this process. And what that's done is it created a practice where instead of decreasing drug spend, they've actually increased drug spend. And some of this can be seen with some of the things that are going on out there in the industry, which is what the reform is trying to pull back. One of them, let's talk just very quickly about lack of transparency. The PBMs mostly do not disclose the rebates and discounts that they get from manufacturers. Now, that makes it difficult for health plans and patients to understand what their new cost their medications. So now I don't know what my true savings or cost is, only what the PBM tells me. Another piece that's causing a problem here is what's called a spread pricing. So the PBM negotiates what they're going to reimburse the pharmacies for when a drug gets spent. They also negotiate with the plan what the plan is supposed to pay them for reimbursing the pharmacy. However, the pharmacy price is lower than the plan's cost. Therefore, they're keeping the difference. Again, not driving down the prices of medications at all. And then finally, you got rebate retention. Now, this is where we get into a part where the manufacturers are trying to pass on savings to the health plan and patients by giving them discounts. Those discounts can be repaired as rebates. They could also be seen as copay benefit programs. Okay, so I'm a patient. It's a little rough for me to pay the copay because the plan's it's a lot of money, especially with these large drug prices. But now I got the PBM saying, well, if the manufacturer is going to pay for some of this, then we're going to reduce what we're going to pay for it. Okay, what that done there does now with the accumulators and maximizer programs out there is it takes away the savings to the patient and moves it to the PBM. Not even the plan, where the plan gets it and can reduce premiums. So those discounts are all stayed as bottom line profit to the PBM. So with those three main concerns and practices out there, it's really driven a long, hard road into trying to reform this.
Your comment on the rebate retention. I mean, this has been a sore spot, right? This has been an area I think it has made individuals pretty uncomfortable, especially in our industry. And again, obviously the whole system is complex, but certainly Washington and the general public, right, is starting to get a little more educated on this. And your comment about the original mission of the PBMs. And the fact that some of these rebates are not going back to reduce premiums, right? They're not actually providing, a plan benefit or more importantly, a member benefit. And certainly, the media is catching on to that. And the retention of profits is again, kind of goes against the original mission, right, of PBMs when they were established.
100%.
Yeah. Let's talk. Beyond the PBM, we have the comment here on the 340B, program as well, and I kind of want to pivot a little bit to 340B, just from a point of view of, again, if we talk about PBMs and maybe PBMs are a little off mission, if you will, as you just highlighted, I think the 340B program has also gotten a little off mission. So maybe what are some of your perspectives on, the original intent of the 340B program and what has caused the program to become such a big challenge for us in the industry?
Yeah, and like you said, Darren, it's a similar situation. The road to tribulation is filled with good intentions, right? If I can say that. So here we have the 340B program, okay? What was the 340 program originally for? Dish hospitals in rural settings who had huge self-pay. And they were giving these hospitals the Medicaid discount, so that way they would alleviate their cash flow. Well, that program has totally expanded now, okay? Similar to the PBMs, their role is expanded as well as people in benefit has expanded. So now we're sitting with a 340B program in 2023, which had $66.3 billion. To put that in some perspective of drug spend, Medicare, $210 billion. Medicaid, I'm going to say the brother, sister to the 340B program, $80 billion, okay? So this is the third largest drug spend program right now. Originally set out to just help dish hospitals, now is the third largest drug spend program. And the growing concerns around this, or the challenges, are basically becoming, because of their rapid expansion, there's limited oversight, okay? And I'll get into a little bit of what that means. Contentious challenges to the pure definition of patient. We can't even understand who a patient is and when that patient should be a beneficiary, okay? And then bring in now, and I could talk for hours on what a contract pharmacy is and administrating them. So now the hospital, the 340B Dish Hospital, now has other contract pharmacies outside the hospital, okay? And the transparency of the drug benefit around that is nil, not very good. And then, of course, HRSA's limited compliance and audit efforts, specifically around the discount double dips. And then manufacturers know what that is. That's where the 340B program, somebody within the program buys the product at the discounts. Let's say if it's a Medicaid discount, so it could be 30% off, 35% off whack, okay? On top of that, I buy that, now and I submit it to Medicaid for a Medicaid claim. And then I get another 30% off. Now the manufacturer's 60% in discount on a product.
Yes.
This is not supposed to be happening. So enhancing the transparency, improving the oversight, and fostering some sort of collaboration within the industry, I think could fulfill its original mission. But right now, there's some things they really need to look into and take care of.
Yeah. So, and Mark, maybe this is a question for you. I mean, with these two things in mind, right? The PBM reform and some of the, I don't want to call it abuse, but some of the breakdowns in the 340B program. I mean, what are you seeing, right, in terms of some of the legislative responses to this?
Yeah, so just to bring it back to PBM, right? I mean, like you both said, the PBM industry's enjoyed over the last year under the radar, but the school of public opinion and the media has really caught on. But now we're also seeing the government catching on, right? And so we're seeing already some proposed legislation to address it. So for PBM specifically, right, the legislative efforts address those three challenges that Tim mentioned, right? There's for example, the Lower Cost, More Transparency Act that addresses the lack of transparency issue. And that was passed by the House with strong bipartisan support, which really looks to increase the transparency in PBM operations and requiring them to disclose more about the rebates and fees to the health plans. The second thing addresses the spread pricing, right? And that's the Pharmacy Benefit Manager Reform Act. So that bill, which passed the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, really seeks to ban that whole spread pricing that Tim talked about, which could really dig into the margin and profit of the industry. And then lastly, there's a number of investigations going on, one in particular with the Federal Trade Commission, who is actively investigating the three largest PBMs, so Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum, for anti-competitive practices. And that's mainly related to the price of insulin, right, where the price of insulin, due to this, let's call it rebate chasing strategy, if you will, has resulted in an increase of the cost of insulin from $20 to just under $300, which is a 1,200% increase. And that is mainly allegedly being driven by the increased rebates that go along with those increased prices. So the government has got these three things going on where they're trying to quickly address it. And, from a challenge standpoint, right, that even though the political landscape with the new administration is complex and somewhat unpredictable, it's largely been bipartisan efforts here. Unless there's some unpredictable change, I don't see those three things or the legislation and the investigations really going away. But who knows? Who knows what can happen this year? But I think due to the bipartisan nature that it should be moving forward.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to put a muzzle on the federal government, so we're not going to hear any updates from any federal agency. But when we do, chances are we're going to hear a flurry. With these ideas in mind, Mark, what's your view on what's industry doing? I mean, what's the industry response been thus far, and what do you think the industry response is going to be, as we move through 25?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly going to be a lot of resistance, right? Particularly around that Pharmacy Benefit Manager Reform Act that digs directly into the rebates. We're talking billions of dollars that could be affected or affecting the industry. So, lobbyists are powerful, right? So PBMs and their allies and the pharma industry and the lobbyists that go along with that are going to put up very strong resistance because it's directly reducing their profit margin. There's that, plus also it's a divided Congress, right? So legislative hurdles that, despite the bipartisan nature of this proposed legislation, in a divided Congress, it's a lot harder to get things passed and through both the House and the Senate. And then lastly, just even if it does pass, right, there's always implementation challenges associated with it. So it's going to require some careful oversight and enforcement to ensure that the PBMs comply with any new regulations that come out of this proposed legislation. So certainly a lot of challenges. So it'll be interesting to see what happens this year.
Yeah.
And if I could leave with just one remark on this, the other side of this, which is the 340B, the industry has taken this on without legislative. And you could see that with J&J's litigation with HRSA, where they tried to change the upfront rebate to a back-end rebate. And that's getting a lot of pushback. And I suggest anybody in the pharma industry to keep their eye on this, because this could definitely be a game changer as in how you contract and discount going further.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tim. Maybe Mark, maybe to put you on the spot, maybe one last question for you. I mean, thinking about the IRA and the CMS negotiation and some of the conversation now about the expansion, of the IRA and enabling CMS to directly negotiate. What are your thoughts on where that's going to evolve to in 25?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? They just released the 15. And you really put me on the spot with that, Darren. But just last week they released the new 15 products that are now open for price negotiation with CMS. I think it's still going to continue down this road. However, there have been, again, some very rapid changes in the government just in a few days of the new administration. The IRA is a President Biden initiative. And so there could be a flip of that just out of, a desire to change the direction from what was done in the past. So we'll see. I don't have a clear answer. I don't think anyone does. Everyone can conjecture, but I don't think anyone really knows what's going to happen this year with the IRA. So it should be an interesting year.
I mean, it's going to be a year we definitely need to keep our eyes open, our ears, listening and trying to figure out what is happening. I think we're definitely going to be in a position as an industry where we're going to need to be able to respond, right? And respond nimbly and quickly to the changes in tone coming out of Washington.
Yeah. And this administration is all about cutting costs and reducing prices of things, right? And if that is the intent of the IRA for price negotiation, and it does in fact result in reduced prices, maybe this administration will support it. So we'll see.
We'll see. One of the things, complying with these changes, as we've been talking about, is always a challenge, right? And I think when we think about the role of legal and the role of the chief compliance officer, we've seen a real kind of shift and emphasis on building efficiency into ethics and compliance programs, right? The reality is, with all of these changes, compliance departments need to be much more risk-focused, much more able and capable of responding to changing demands, which means that some of the routine business activities that are subject to regulation and the focus of ethics and compliance programs really need to be streamlined and operating in a highly mature manner at this stage of our industry's evolution, especially now being 20 plus years post OIG guidance. And with that, I want to bring Sam Sutherland, Mario Prohaski, into the conversation, especially as we talk about driving efficiency and scale, into compliance programs. And let's kind of start it off in terms of, as we look at how we see industry streamlining, standardizing, simplifying, how they engage with HCPs. What are some of the trends we've seen there, and where do we think those things are going to evolve, here in the coming 12 months?
Darren, I can jump in here, and that's a great question and a segue from the prior conversation. I think we're going to see a continuous evolution and maybe in some ways even an acceleration of some of the trends we've already observed in the last couple of years. So yeah, I think big picture, I think the role of compliance is going to continue to shift, particularly in terms of HCP engagement, but I would also extend it to other risk management areas, to one of really being a true business partner and advisor to the business, as opposed to the function that always is the control. And if I take HCP engagement as a specific area, I think that's occurring and will continue to occur both in terms of some of the pre-engagement controls, so managing the HCP selection and nomination process, the fair market value and tiering, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But also, I think in other areas, in terms of broader due diligence and even at a broader controls at the end of the process around payment and execution of HCP engagement payments as well. So I think the role is going to continue to evolve, really one of an advisor, where the controls are going to be embedded. And that's why the use of technology and data is going to be continuously very important. And we as compliance professionals are also going to have to accelerate our own shift in that direction in terms of our skills and knowledge to be better users of technology and data to really be providing kind of business added value as partners, and removing as much of the more operational tasks from our plate. That's been ongoing, I think, for a couple of years now, but I think we're going to see a continuous acceleration of that into this year and going forward. And I think that's driven by both the overall industry trend, but I think also there's a shift in terms of how we need to operate commercially as organizations as well. And that needs to be done at scale, right? So this is kind of the challenge. So it needs to be done at scale and needs to be done in a way that allows the business processes to be efficient, but also to be customer friendly in terms of how we interact as compliance professionals or as pharma and biotech organizations with HCPs as well.
I really appreciate, I would say the emphasis of, of the past, couple of years, right? More of an emphasis on the physician experience, right? Not buying for the sake of compliance, but now trying to focus on streamlining and improving, the HCP's experience when engaging, with industry. And I think that has also been a result of some of the changes in some of the, call it the roles and responsibilities for HCP engagement, and specifically, the role of compliance. So maybe we can, what are your thoughts, or Sam, your thoughts on, the changing role of the compliance team in managing global HCP engagements?
Yeah, it's funny when we're talking about kind of evaluating KOLs and the impact on valuation, and just thinking about where is this kind of very historic process going. Mario said it. It's all about automation. It's all about leveraging data. And really with the ultimate goal of, as Mario stated, kind of that compliance office moving into more of an advisor role than that kind of historical policing role. You want to empower, and you need that automation that has those embedded controls. You need that data that's objective, that you're relying upon to assign fair market value rates and assign an expertise level, or what we call tiering. If you are going to be empowering the business to really own a lot of the process, you need to kind of give them all the tools, and then also just make sure that you have those important controls in place so that you can prohibit as much inappropriate behavior as you possibly can. Whenever we're talking about sort of, evaluating KOLs and valuation, what definitely seeing more and more companies just leveraging objective, publicly available data to assign a tier level. So that old process of going back and forth to get a CV, using 45 minutes to comb through a 30-page CV, picking out really specific criteria. I mean, that is the world of the past. I think anyone who lives in compliance and legal or medical who has done that before is psyched for that to be over. But it really is, it really is kind of using, instead of those CV documents, leveraging a KOL profiling database to assign that expertise level with the same exact criteria as you had before. You're not losing anything that's really profound or important to the methodology that's defensible when you're assigning a tier level based on data as opposed to a CV document. The one thing I will also just touch on in terms of valuation and your fair market value methodology, we also see it's really important to make sure you have a consistent baseline, or what we call like foundational methodology, but allow for nuances on a country by country basis. So if you're applying the same thresholds for, let's just say, a tier 1 HCP doing a certain number of publications or clinical trials, we know through our partnership with Definitive Healthcare that the number of pubs and the number of clin trials can differ greatly depending on the country. Western Europe, the United States, Canada, very prevalent in those types of activities. APAC, LATAM, some emerging nations, Eastern Europe, they just don't do that same volume. So you also need to make sure that you have that base consistent methodology, but change some of the qualifying factors, the thresholds, the lists of your top category institutions, your top leading journals on a country by country basis. So something else really important to make sure that you're including. If you're not, all of those HCPs in those emerging nations are going to be falling out as tier 3s and 2s when really they're not. You just have criteria that's not applicable to that country. Yeah.
Sam, if I may jump in here, so I think to kind of bring us back to the question around how do we continue to provide a better, more optimized physician experience when we have all of this technology and data available to us. So I think it's what I expect to see this year is a sort of almost like we as industry continuing to evaluate how to meet the HCPs where it makes the most sense for them. So how do we continue to communicate and interact with them? And as we have more data and technology tools, that perception may continue to shift. So for example, do we continue to use physician-facing portals to interact with the physicians, or is that going to be something that will need to be combined with some level of kind of more human-centric approach? One area I think that is also experiencing a significant shift in some respects in terms of HCP engagement is the payment process. The payment processes used to be executed kind of in a fairly disparate manner by industry. We're seeing more centralization there. We're seeing kind of uses of new technology around payment processing as well. And that results in faster turnaround times of payments, which improves the physician experience, but it also, I think, improves the overall ability of industry to control that process, which is critical. Absolutely. So how we interact with the physicians is going to continue to change as we have more data and technology available to us.
Yeah. No, I mean, Mario, that evolution of, how that process is being controlled and better use of technology for controlling that, more centralization, all to, I guess, to both of your points, making us more efficient and scalable across the industry. As we think about efficiency and scale, when we think about, risk management, compliance is just one of several risk domains that we see industry challenged with addressing, right? And I want to bring John Regula into the conversation as we think about enterprise risk management. This industry being so innovative, John, such a highly innovative industry. I think there's an opportunity, and we've seen companies leveraging, methodologies like ERM to create advantage, especially when needing to manage through these disparate risk domains. So I'm curious, how have you seen, risk management as a discipline evolve inside the life science industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Darren. And I think enterprise risk management is such an appropriate topic when we're focused on the future, right? Often, to answer your question, historically within life sciences, when you say enterprise risk management, what a client is often thinking is a risk assessment, and a risk assessment focused on compliance, right? And enterprise risk management is so much more than that. Enterprise risk management is a framework that helps us identify, assess, prioritize, which is a risk assessment, but then going beyond that, managing, reporting, and monitoring on risk across the company, right? And I think it's important to define risk. Risk is not an issue, right? Often we've seen programs focused on the near term, the here and now, and it becomes an issue management program. But risk is a future uncertainty, right? It's an uncertainty. It hasn't happened yet. And it's also not only negative, but could be positive. It can be an opportunity, right? So it's really focused on identifying those uncertainties against our long-range plan and our long-term performance of what we're trying to become. And looking across, again, not just compliance, but looking across all risk, looking at strategic, financial, operational, regulatory, environmental, and technology risk, right? We like to use the acronym FOREST. And looking across all those categories, and then looking at, again, forward-looking, if we look forward against our long-range plan, often 3 to 5 years, what are those opportunities and obstacles that we need to define to help us ensure that we're reducing the volatility against our overall performance?
Yeah, and John, I love the way you defined, ERM and its use as a tool inside life sciences, and maybe if you provide some more perspective on how you've seen ERM drive value, back into the business.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think of a specific client that I was working with. It was a biotech, right? And their business was a single product, extremely successful, hockey stick growth, right? And the ERM program, because of that, was very focused on the operational risk to that singular product, as well as the compliance challenges to that product. But we were engaged to work with the CEO and the CFO in understanding, well, how are we going to sustain this growth, right? How are we going to continue to drive value for our shareholders by taking a broader look at what we need to become, not what we are now, right? And so we shifted the focus of the program to the long-term strategy, right? What are our growth objectives beyond this singular product? And by taking that shift of focus, it broadened the thinking of the leadership team to not the here and the now, but let's define what that strategy is, who we're going to be in 5 years, and then use our enterprise risk management again to identify what are the barriers, what could go wrong, but equally important, what do we need to assure that will go right, the opportunities, in order to achieve that growth objective.
That's a great example, John. I appreciate that. One of the things I'm always perplexed by, in my nearly 25 years in this industry, talking about, kind of stakeholder relations, right? Managing the needs of various stakeholders, both internal and external stakeholders, and the profound impact that has on how management sets priorities. And just given that, the timeline for development and commercialization is so substantial and the evidence needs are so strong, we're often seeing organizations being challenged with what is good evidence, what is the evidence focus that we need to be, addressing at any given moment in time. I want to pull Keith, into the conversation now, just so we can kind of dig into this piece just a little bit. And maybe just before we do that, a quick reminder to the participants, if you have questions on anything that we've covered, feel free to use that Q&A tab. We should have a couple of minutes to address questions at the end. But Keith, let's talk about stakeholder management and the robust evidence requirements that a lot of these stakeholders have. And specifically as we see early stage companies moving towards commercialization, how do you see this evolving, right? Kind of managing stakeholder expectations, whether we're talking about investors and shareholders, we're talking about management, we're talking about, the coverage entities, the payers. How do you see some of those stakeholder challenges feeding through into the evidence strategy and the commercial adoption?
Great question, Darren. I think one thing to consider is that, a lot of companies, they don't necessarily start strategizing for commercial adoption early enough. Ideally, companies should really start thinking about that commercial adoption strategy during the early clinical stages, right? And there's, to your point, all the key stakeholders involved. There's a number of reasons why it's important, right? Understanding the market need and demand for the product, right? So ensuring that your product meets those expectations of the key stakeholders as you go through that strategy development across the payers, the providers, as well as the patients, right? So that early engagement with key stakeholders can provide some valuable insights. A regulatory strategy alignment, helps, streamline that approval process, right? Or it could, reduce the time it may take and the risk of delays. Right. And we know now, kind of forward thinking, with the new administration in place, there may be some reductions to kind of the regulatory red tape to potentially accelerate, patient access to innovative treatments. Right. Historically speaking, it used to take at times, or still takes, around 5 years from FDA approval to Medicare coverage. There have been some discussions around, removing that timeline, right. Or greatly reducing it. Right. So, being forward thinking and having those strategies early on in the process is going to be paramount for success, especially if we're talking about the reduction of time it takes, where a lot of companies start thinking about the commercial adoption strategy throughout those timelines. Another one really is around HEOR, so health economics and outcomes research. We've seen a lot of hospital consolidations, a lot of provider closures in the past, right? Thinning margins So having products being adopted in a hospital setting requires a much more refined review around the economic benefits of a product. Obviously, the clinical evidence is the foundation, the building blocks of approval, getting regulatory access, right? But getting that product into the market will require some additional review from a health economic standpoint, knowing, the provider closures that continue to ramp up. So, setting themselves up for success, it's really just the early stage process of starting that evidence generation planning and making sure everyone's involved.
I think, you got to make a couple of mentions to the new administration and potential changes coming from FDA on the approval process. I mean, and this is one of the areas, I think Mark even indicated earlier in the conversation, like we don't know really what's going to come out of the new administration, but certainly, the mission of reducing red tape and accelerating the approval process is one to keep an eye on. I think we've seen a therapeutic area, a category level prioritization becoming much more prevalent, at least in some of the spoken remarks. So it will be interesting to see how some of that comes to pass, in the coming months. As we think about, this commercial strategy, the product adoption, I mean, who have you generally seen, Keith, as a part of that conversation? When do those conversations, really start to commence, and how do you see that focus in 2025 evolving?
Yeah, good point, Darren. The more stakeholders you have involved, internal stakeholders in those conversations, it's going to be a great benefit, right? Historically speaking, it's been a lot focused around clinical medical affairs, right? But as you drive towards commercialization, you need to ensure that your market access teams, your commercialization teams, as well as your HEOR teams are involved in that process earlier on, because it's gonna create your roadmap for the future. It's going to allow for multi-use of information as you develop the strategy, right, and start to disseminate that evidence. It's also going to eliminate gaps downstream, right, and that's going to reduce the time. Because if you are collecting information that is going to be beneficial, further down in the product life cycle, it's going to allow for a much more expedited or easier pathway for that product adoption.
Yeah, that's a great point, Keith. And maybe in light of kind of how much time we have left, I'll kind of invite all of the panelists, kind of back to the virtual stage. And just kind of close out the conversation with a couple of questions, for the team and kind of whoever, maybe wants to jump in on some of these questions. We heard in Michelle Kupka, your remarks early on about the continued focus in personalized medicine, the gene and cell therapy being, a big part of that. We're embarking upon a period within our industry where we're not just managing chronic diseases, but potentially curing chronic diseases. And that's going to drive some fundamental changes in our clients' business models, reimbursement and otherwise. And I'm curious, anybody want to jump in, your perspectives on how you see the execution for our client, for the industry changing as we move towards, personalized medicines and some of these cures for chronic disease.
Yeah, I can jump in first, Darren. I think it's an interesting road, right? Because historically our reimbursement, kind of structure hasn't allowed for these types of novel products, right? We've been built on a fee-for-service kind of arrangement, thinking about it from a med device standpoint, right? You get a service, you pay for, you get paid for such service, right? But when we talk about, mitigating downstream events in perpetuity, right? Health plans only look at forecasting costs, 12 months, right? So, how do they handle that robust cost metric, in that 12-month time frame, and knowing that patients typically only stay on health insurance plans 12, 18, 24 months. So there has to be some type of collaboration, right? And CMS has actually gone through and created a cell and gene therapy access model And basically, they'll go through and negotiate the outcomes-based agreements with the manufacturer. The state will then decide whether or not to enter into the agreement, and then CMS will basically, implement and reconcile and evaluate that program. So I'm seeing a little more of that, but it will be challenging, going forward from a reimbursement standpoint. It has to be a very creative model.
Yeah. Hey, are there other thoughts on kind of some of the impact here as we think about?
Yeah, Darren, just so you know, from the gross to net perspective, especially internally with life science companies, with all these new legislations as well as all these new initiatives, you're going to have a very creative sales force with very creative ways to get discounts and other things and create more prescription drug out there. So it's very, very important during this time, as always, but even more so now, that finance, market access, contracting, and legal are speaking on a monthly basis, if not twice a month, on what's going on, where the company's going, where we're going, how it's, because the only way the finance folks are going to be able to really truly identify the drug performance financially is by making sure they understand where they're going and what's going on. And that doesn't mean I signed a contract, now implement it. It means we're about to sign a contract, can we implement it? And that needs to really take place.
Yeah. We've talked throughout the past hour, that we've been talking. I mean, we've talked about, dry powder, the cash sitting, on the sidelines, the favorable M&A market that we're entering, changes in the legislative landscape, concerns or questions or uncertainty around the new administration. I mean, John, all of this makes me feel like a conversation about how we measure and monitor risk appetite inside of our enterprise is essential. And I'm curious, your view on leading practices or what your advice is to industry, when thinking about managing and monitoring risk appetite.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you nailed it, Darren, on the term measurement, right? Which is often so lacking from a program. And in enterprise risk management, we use the term risk appetite, which is often misunderstood, right? Risk appetite is the amount and willingness to take risks in pursuit of our long-term strategy and performance objectives. And if you think about that definition, it's really there to provide guidance to those developing our strategy and to the business in the execution of that strategy. And because of that, we need to put risk appetite into the language of the business, right? It shouldn't be a risk dialogue. It should be a performance and business objectives dialogue. I'll give you an example, right? One of our clients is very focused on growing their footprint globally, right? And so they have a risk appetite focused on strategy and market expansion. And they define their risk appetite. And there's measures against this, but I didn't use the specific measures. But we will accept a moderate risk, and they define moderate, with entering new markets with a focus on our risk tolerance, again, measurement, to our regulatory challenges that we're going to face and the new competitive pressures that will be put upon us, right? And when you put measure against that, it's such a great directive, again, to our strategy, where are we focusing, and to the business on where we're willing to accept and not accept risk in the execution of that objective.
Yeah. Darren, maybe I'll add one more thing. It's just John kind of prompted me to think about is really having that kind of enterprise risk view also allows us to think about the knock-on effects of activities or developments here in the U.S. and the impact they have globally. So having that global enterprise risk view is helpful. If I even just take pricing and reimbursement, for example, I mean, what happens here and some of the legislative trends here will have a direct impact down the line on pricing and reimbursement decisions that happen that our clients will need to make in other parts of the world. It's already difficult to bring products to market in Europe, for example. I was just reading something the other day. The regulatory process in Europe on average takes about 600 days to go through kind of bring a new therapy to approval. And imagine what that would look like if we have even more pricing and cost pressures because of what happens here. from a pricing and reimbursement perspective. So that enterprise risk view, I think, is really a powerful way to think about how we manage risk also from a global perspective.
Yeah, no, great point, Mario. Again, the U.S. share of the global market, and how those profits and how that working capital is reinvested into the global industry. And certainly, if we see large reform in the U.S. that shrinks the amount of working capital generated out of the U.S., it definitely could have global implications in every aspect of our market business. So with that, we are at the top of the hour. I know we covered a lot of material. I want to thank everybody for joining Baker Tilly today for this conversation. A special thank you to all of my colleagues for enduring my Q&A for the past hour, but I thought it was a great dialogue. We will be following up with all of the attendees. We will be publishing a lot of the insights we talked about today a little bit deeper, in our upcoming industry forecast white paper. So I will be sure to share that with you all. And thank you for spending this hour with us.